Welcome everyone. Today, as Sandra said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to parse text from your target application. What happens sometimes is that we have maybe, a custom object, or we have an environment that AscentialTest doesn't support, or maybe we just have an application where there was some text that was painted on a canvas that doesn't have a handle. It's not a real Windows object, but we need to parse it. And most of you know that sometimes render text will help in that situation, but there are other cases where it doesn't work. So there's always the opportunity to actually use what I will call low-level commands, which I'm going to teach you, in order to capture text and parse text from your target application. So we're going to take a look at that. As we go through the solution, we're going to learn a little bit more about how we can use a record in AscentialTest and how we can use the list class in order to organize that captured text. Then I'm going to talk about the string class, because the string class has some actions or methods in it that will allow us to parse that text into meaningful units. Because usually when we want to get text from the application, we want to parse it into something that's meaningful. Maybe we want to verify certain values, but we need to separate the parts that we want to verify from maybe all the other parts that we're not interested in. So I'm going to be going into those two classes, the list class and the string class. Toward the end of the presentation, I have a user story from one of our customers that I thought was really interesting. So I asked them if I can share it with you, so I'm going to. And then at the end, I'll give you a little peek at what's coming up real soon in AscentialTest 9. And as Sandra said, you can ask questions at the end, or I'll answer questions at the end. You can fire them off as you think of them. So again, the problem that we're dealing with here in this seminar this morning is that we've got text that's not accessible through regular objects that are recognized by AscentialTest. So again, maybe a custom object, maybe a text technology that we don't yet support, or maybe there's some security reason that we're not able to, access part of the application. Now, just because I needed an example, I just came up with Slack. And maybe some of you guys use Slack. We use Slack in our company in order to communicate with each other. And I took a picture of it. Here's the real thing right here. I might bring it over because I think it's a little clearer. Yeah. And so you'll notice in here, this is not a real conversation because I didn't want to invade anybody's privacy in our company. So this is just a little notepad for myself, and I just put some stuff here. I purposefully put some information that I want to parse, like I have a field here, first name, last name, email, and so forth, and then I've just got some random sentences here. But this is an example of, and let me move this back aside, this is an example of an application that we can't see anything in. And the reason is because this is a CEF. It's Slack, like Spotify, is built with Electron, I believe. And we would be able to test Slack if the remote debugging port was set and we knew the remote debugging port. So those of you that use our technology, our CEF technology on your own applications know that in order to see inside of this Chrome window, basically is what it is, it's a CEF, an embedded Chrome, we'd need the remote debugging port. Well, I don't have the remote debugging port for Slack because they're not one of our customers. But I want to use this as an example of how I can parse this information. Okay, so we have we'll call it a custom object, or an object that we can't see. But I want to get this conversation, and again, I want to pull this over again so you can see it a little bit more clearly. You'll notice that the conversation is organized. I can see the time, the sender, and then I can see the message. This is what I was interested in: time, sender, message. So try to keep that in your head as we go through these slides and the solution that I'm going to show you. The first thing is I need a way to get that text. And the way that we can do that pretty easily is by using the system clipboard. So you know that, like, if you highlight something and you say Control C, it puts it on the clipboard. And then if you wanted to paste it in your application somewhere, you would just do Control V and then you would paste it. Well, not that different in AscentialTest. I'm going to use type keys to do my Control A, which is select all, and then the Control C, which is copy. Now, I'm not going to do a Control V because I don't want to paste it anywhere, but I know that when I do that, it actually puts it on the clipboard. And in the system class, you might remember from, I think, the last seminar, I went through the system class, there's something called get clipboard. So anything that is currently on the clipboard will come back to AscentialTest through this action called get clipboard as a list of string. So let me go over to my AscentialTest now, and I want to show you what I'm doing. And I'm going to run this for you. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and run it. Now you can't see it actually highlight, but it did it because I've got it over on the other screen now, because if I tried to share two screens, it would be too small. But you saw it run, and I'll show you what happened. So basically what I did was I clicked inside of Slack. So I set Slack active, and then I did the type keys that I just showed you on the slide. Control A, which highlights everything, Control C, which puts it on the clipboard. Then I wanted to get it from the clipboard into a list. Okay, so I've got a list of string, and I created it right here. It's called clipboard text. I use ls as a sort of a camelback notation for list string, ls, clipboard text. So I get it in there into the clipboard text. And then I just click Slack again to unhighlight what the Control A did, so that if I ran it for you again, it would already be unhighlighted. Now, what I wanted to do was, I don't want the blank lines, because if I showed you what it looked like raw, you would see a bunch of blank lines in between all of the things that I'm interested in. So I got rid of those. And the way that I did it was I created a loop. So I say for, and this is what we call our for each loop, even though the word each isn't actually specified. That's how we read it. For each string, S line, in the list. So imagine yourself looping through a list, line by line. If the line is blank, in other words, if the string equals nothing, then if it's not nothing, then I add it to this other list that I've passed in as an output parameter. So this is the conversation that is organized by date time. And I did print it here just so that we can look at it. And if you look at what's going on here, you can see exactly what got put into the list. Now, it's not really organized yet. That's the next part of it. It's really just raw with the blank lines removed. Okay, I'll refer back to that in a couple of minutes. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to parse that conversation. But before I do that, I actually want to run it for you so you can see the result. I'm going to run it first. So it's running. It called not only the step that I showed you, get conversation, but you can see it called parse conversation and parse record, which we're going to go into right now in a lot more detail. But before I do, I want to show you again. This is the raw with the lines removed that came from the first step. And you can see that step is get conversation, so we can collapse that down. And then we can see that parse conversation, which we're going to look at next, actually parsed it into something. It organized it, basically. You can see now that I've organized the conversation by the date, the time, AM or PM, the sender, and then the actual lines that were written. And you can see that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 messages in this conversation. So now I want to start to take it apart for you. And then at the end, we'll look at this parse record, which was another example. I wanted to show you how to populate a record. So let's see, let me just check my notes here. I want to make sure that I told you everything that I had planned to tell you. Okay, so now let's take a look at the conversation itself. And I'm going to look at a record. So what I did was I created a record, and I think I showed it to you on the slide here. Yeah. Okay, so here we have the conversation, and again, you see the time, the sender, and then the message. And what I did was I needed a way to organize this conversation. And so what I did was I created a record. And I'm going to show you how to create a record in a minute in case you don't know. I called my record message, and I have 3 fields in my record. The timestamp, which is right here, the sender, which is right here in this sort of teal color, and then the message. Now the message is not just a string. It can be a string, but it can also be a list of string. So what I did instead is I created something called message lines, which is simply just a list of string. And I included that in my record. So let's just take a quick look for a second. In case someone doesn't know how to create a record, I want to show you how you do that. Here is my record right here. That's the record I just showed you the picture of. But to create a record in AscentialTest is really quite easy. You just right-click on record, say new record, and then you give your record a name. So, this is my record. And then I start to define the fields. So, I could say, time, stamp. And it'll default to string unless I tell it otherwise. Sender. And then here, I had my messages, and I had already created that list called message lines. So that's all there is to creating the record. I don't need it because I've already got my record right here. Okay, so now you see what the record looks like. Now let's talk about how I parsed that conversation. Now to parse the conversation, what I did was I created a loop. And this time I'm using the classic for loop, not the for each loop that I showed you before. This is the classic for loop, and I'll talk about that in just a sec. But I do want you to see that I've got an input parameter. This is the conversation that came from getConversation. Just to refer back to the test, you can see that getConversation output the list, the ls conversation by date time. And I dragged that into my second step, which was parse conversation. So you can see it's getConversation dot, and then the output parameter here. So the output parameter from the first step becomes the input parameter of the second step. Okay, and you'll notice this one has an output parameter as well, because I'm then passing that onto here. But we'll talk about that after. I wanted you to see that. Okay, so let's take a look at the loop. So here again, a classic for loop. I say for, and then I create an integer called iLine. So this is my index. Think about this as an index that's going to go through the list, one line after another. So this is line 1, which is where I'm going to start. And I'm going to stay in my loop until I get to the end of the conversation. And the way that I'm going to do that is the conversation comes in as a list of string, and I do a count on it. So this is how my loop stops. When iLine, it'll stay in there as long as iLine, which is this variable here, is less than or equal to the total number of lines in the conversation. And then every time I go through the loop, I want to increment the iLine. I want to increment my index because I don't want to keep staying on the same line. I want to keep incrementing my line. And you'll see that I actually do that inside the loop as well, which can be tricky to do. So let's take a look now at what's going on. So I go through line by line, and what I'm doing is I'm using a combination of some actions in my list class and some actions in my string class that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in order to make sense of the lines in this conversation. So I'm going through line by line, and I've got this, here's a variable of this type. Remember the type that I just showed you. So here's my record. I've got a variable of the type that I call message with a lowercase m. Since my record has an uppercase m, I have to distinguish them. And then I say if the line that I'm on now contains a colon and it contains either AM or PM, then I know I hit one of those lines, one of my new, the new conversation, just to remind you. I hit one of these lines. It's not one of these lines here where I've got the continued message. It's like a new message line. So I hit one of those lines. And again, I've got a couple operators here. I have the and, which is the double ampersand, and the or. So I'm saying, and notice I put the parens in just to make it clear they're not required by the compiler. But I say if, excuse me, the conversation line contains, so contains is an action that's built into the library of the string class. If the line contains the colon and it contains, and then here you see the parens are open, it means do this first. The conversation contains either AM or PM. So if I hit one of those lines, then I'm going to start to populate my record. So I have message dot timestamp. Remember, if we look at the message, if we look at the record, it's timestamp, sender, and message. 3 fields that we need to remember. So I populate the timestamp, and then I know from looking at the raw conversation, I have to go to the next line in order to get the sender, because that was how the clipboard was arranged. So I bump up my line and I grab the sender off of the next line. But you'll notice that the next line doesn't just have the sender, it's also got the beginning of the conversation. So what I have to do is I have to use this parser. This is built right into the string class and it's called getField. We're going to look at this in more detail in a little while. But what I want to do is I want to take that line and I want to say, I want to parse this line, and I'm going to parse it on a space. This is the delimiter here. And I want what was before, I want the first field before the space, and I'm going to trim it. That's what this means right here. So that's how I'm going to populate my sender. Then I have to start to build my conversation, which can be one or more lines. And so I've got another variable that I'm creating here called conversation lines, and it's a list of string. And I'm going to add, this is a member of the string of the list class, I'm going to add a part of the line. I'm using getField again to get the message. And notice what I'm doing here. I parsed out the sender. I parsed out the sender from the line, and then I'm using the sender as my delimiter. You can do that. So this variable now is being used as a delimiter, because whereas I used field 1 to get the sender, I want to use field 2 after the sender to get the first part of the message. And I'm going to trim it again. So now I've got my timestamp, I've got my sender, and I've got at least line 1 of the message. Now I need something that says, well, how do I know whether or not this is a multi-line message or a single line message? So what I need to do now is I need to look at the next line. So you'll see I say, look at I-line +1, the next line, and again, do the same check that I did up here. Does this contain AM? Well, part of it. Does it contain AM or PM, or jot something down, which is the end of my list? So if it contains any of those things, then I'm done. I'm going to write my record, and I'm going to continue, which means go down to the bottom of the loop and go back up and find the next message. Otherwise, the else is going to handle the multi-line message. So now what I'm doing is I'm bumping up my line, and I'm going to go ahead and add that next line to my list of lines, which makes up the message. And again, I keep checking. Have I hit the bottom, or am I at the next message? If I am, break. Otherwise, I stay in this loop, and I grab all the lines of that particular message. Finally, when I'm done, then I add that message to my list of messages, and then I print it. And just to remind you what the result of all that was, this right here. So we see the date time, the timestamp, the sender, and then the message, which could be one line or it can be multiple lines. And they're separated by a comma. So it's not really as hard as I think it looks when you really start to think about it. I'm only using a few different things. I'm using contains, I'm using count, I'm using get field, and I'm using add. That's pretty much what went on here. And we'll talk about those things in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So just to kind of review, I parsed the conversation using the list class to organize the text. I looped through the conversation lines, and then I added the lines to my list of record. I used the string class. Specifically, I used contains and I used get field. Now here's a little look at the list class. You see the list class has got more than what I used. It's got a whole bunch of different actions. The ones that I used were count up at the top of the loop because I wanted to make sure that I got out of the loop when I reached the end of the list. And then I used add in order to add records to my list of records. Here's a look at, this is not the whole string class. If we wanted to see the whole string class, we could come right over here, and you can see in the Actions Explorer, you can see that the string class actually is quite a large class. It might be our largest class. It's got a lot of different actions in it. I just kind of pulled out the ones that I tend to use a lot. Contains, we use that one. Does it contain a particular value? Get field is that parser that I used. I've got another example. Index of, if you give it a string, a character, it'll tell you what's the index of the first occurrence of that character. I have an example of that I'm going to run for you. You can insert into a string. You can see there's a whole bunch of these is. I called them is, and I'll show you. There's like is alphanumeric, is empty, is null or empty, is numeric, is space. So there's a whole bunch of these where you can pass it a string and it will tell you, is it empty, true or false? Is it null or empty, true or false? So those are useful as well. You can join two strings. You can get the leftmost character of a string, the rightmost character, the length of a string. You can remove a character. You can replace a character. Again, I have examples of some of these things in a few minutes. You can split something by a delimiter into a list of string. Convert a string all to upper, all to lower. You can trim left, right, or trim everything. So the string class is a very, very useful class when you're going to be doing the kinds of things that we have talked about. Now, I've got some more examples. I'm going to talk about this last piece because I showed you how I organized the conversation, but then I also told you that I wanted to show you how to populate a record. So I created another record called person data, and for each person I've got the first name, the last name, and the email address. So 3 fields again in the record, and you can see that I ended up parsing the person data. First name equals Brian, last name Lesor, and email address. I could have parsed out that edited if I wanted to. That just happened to be there because I edited the conversation. But let's take a peek at that parse record. So if we look again, parse record takes in the message. So it takes in that organized list from here. It takes this list in, and I pass that into parse record. And what parse record does, so in comes the message, and again, there's two loops here. So it says for each message in the messages, now it goes in and it looks at each line. And it says if it contains first name, then populate the record. And again, I'm using get field. See, I'm using two. And the reason why I'm doing that, if we look back here, is because you can see that it's first name, colon, and then the value, last name, colon, and then the value. So here, I'm trying to get the value. So I'm looking for first name. If it includes that, then I parse on the colon. So I'm getting the second field, meaning the field after the colon. Doing the same thing with last name, and then finally with the email address. So once you get the pattern of this, it's not really hard to do at all. And if you guys want to study this stuff again, this is going to be on YouTube afterwards, so you can always pause the presentation at any point and you can stare at it a little bit and see how it's done. Now, I've got some examples for you of the string class that I want to go through. I've got quite a few, actually, I thought were interesting. So we're going to take them one at a time. And I'm trying to be mindful of the time this time. Last time I think I went way over. I'll try not to do that today. So if I'm given a sample string, like this is a test string, let's take a look at some of the members of the string class that we can use in order to make sense of this string and maybe parse it. So here I've got one of contains. And you know I used contains in the larger example, but now I'm kind of making it a little bit smaller, so it might be a little bit easier to understand. So I'm saying if the sample string contains the word test, then print the string. And if I run it for you, the string, this is a test string, contains the word test. So you can see it right there. Now let's comment this one, and we'll uncomment the next one. So this one uses that get field, and this is a very, very useful action. I use this all the time. It parses it for you. It does all the hard work for you. And so if I was to read this, it says, from the sample string, do a get field on the word string and give me the first field. So that means everything before the delimiter. So this is the delimiter, space string, give me everything before the delimiter. So if I run it, we get this is a test, which is everything before the delimiter. That's what the one means. This one is index of. So let's run this one. So index of gives you the index of the first occurrence of the character. So there's the S right there. It's the fourth character in the string. Left and right are useful as well. So left will give you the leftmost character. If I did right, it would end up giving you the G, because that would be the rightmost character. And you can say how many you want. So if I say, 2 and run it, then I'm going to get TH, right? So you can get as many characters as you want. So if really all you want is to knock, to grab the first two characters out of something, it's quite easy to do, or the last two characters, or I should say the last n characters, first n characters. Excuse me. Here, I'm going to call replace. So watch what happens when I run this. So what I did was I replaced every space, every occurrence of a space, I replaced it with a dash. So we ended up with this dash is dash a dash and so forth. And then my last example is called split. And so what split did was it took the string and it parsed it into a list of string using the space as the delimiter. So that was just a sampling of the string class. And you can see there's some really useful actions or methods in there. Now I'm going to show you an example that I think is a little bit more, real world. I think a lot of times, when we're testing, the application will generate some string, and we want to make sense of that string. In other words, we might want to verify parts of that string, but maybe not the whole string, because maybe the string has some parts of it that are difficult or impossible to verify because they've been generated and I can't compare them to some expected result. So I want to take that string and I want to pull out all the meaningful parts so that I can verify them. So let's run this. And we'll take a look at it. So what I did was I took this string and I pulled out the things that maybe I want to verify. So I took out the date, I took out the number, I took out the cost, I took out the shipping status. And I did it by using various of those actions that I talked about. And you'll see, a lot of get field. So here I used left because I knew that the first 10 characters were going to be the date. So I used left in order to parse out the date. Here I used get field, but I had to do two get fields, right? Because this number that I want was in between this pound sign and this dollar sign, and then I wanted to trim it. So you can chain them together. So I called get field, and then I called get field on the result of the get field. So actually this one, and the result was passed to this one. So I parsed it like that. Looks a little tricky, but once again, once you kind of get the pattern, it's not hard to do. This was sort of the opposite. Getting that. And then again, I use that technique that I talked about earlier. Once you get one piece of it, you can use that piece to parse out something else. So once you got the price, then it was easy to get the status because you could use the price. You knew the price was after the status. So you can use the result of one parsing to get another one. Sometimes you parse something out that you don't even care about just so that you can use it as a delimiter to parse something else out. Okay. I forgot what this was about. I don't think this was part of this presentation. I think I was showing somebody something else because I don't see this in my notes. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to tell you a story that comes from a user. So we have a customer, MACCS in the Netherlands, and Waldemar was generous enough to let me share this story with you because the story came through tech support, but I thought it was interesting in that I thought it would be useful for you, the audience, and he was generous enough to allow me to share this story. So thank you, Waldemar, for letting me share this. MACCS is a film, they're software for film distributors and cinema operators. They're located in the Netherlands and they have customers worldwide. The software is pretty complex because of regional differences and customization. So it's used in different countries, and of course there's different customs and so forth, and ways that the software is used. So it's fairly complex and it's customized for different locales. They've been using AscentialTest since early 2019, and they test a Power Builder-based application. They started out with a suite of about 100 test cases for their largest customer. And most of their cases can be run independently, but sometimes they have series of tests that are dependent upon each other. And as I looked through the way Waldemar does things, I see he's adopted some variation of the strategy that we proposed in a seminar quite a while ago, and how you can have a test look at a prerequisite test to make sure that it passed before the test runs. So you can always go back and look at a previous seminar if you're curious about that. But here's what I thought was really interesting. So they execute 4 nightly build tests using the Windows scheduler. So they schedule their tests using the Windows scheduler. And in the morning, they expect to get a PDF of the results, which I'm going to share with you in a little bit, because he generated a report for us. So in the morning, he expects to come in and get a report on these nightly builds. And he noticed a recurring problem where AscentialTest would throw an object not found error. And they search for a cause, and some of you might have experienced this. They run the test again and it would pass. They noticed that if they ran it during the day versus during the night, they generally found that the daytime runs worked a little bit better, but still they did see it sometimes. Now, they did discover one thing that was observable, that at nighttime, sometimes an application would actually receive one of those messages where it's going to get an automated update. And of course, that would be an unforeseen circumstance that could certainly cause a test to fail. And if you weren't using a good recovery system in your app state, I suppose it could cause your whole automation to fail, but I'm pretty sure Waldemar has recovery built in, so it probably caused some failures, but then he would recover and continue. So they started experimenting with different AscentialTest settings, and they tried like the command start and the command finish. Didn't seem to have any effect. Finally, now we didn't know this was going on, finally they contacted support, and we suggested that he try increasing the resolve timeout. And in case you don't know where that is, I want to show you. So if you go to your project settings and you go to runtime defaults, you'll see that the resolve timeout is actually set pretty low by default. What the resolve timeout does is it says to AscentialTest, wait at least 5 seconds before object not found error is reported. So we're going to give the application 5 seconds to render all of its objects. Well, what Waldemar found was that that wasn't enough time for his application. He gave his setting a generous 60 seconds. And he said now in retrospect, it seems obvious that the time that they were allocating was just not enough for this very large complex application to render all of its objects. So once he made that change, the problem went away. And so his comment was that, he said the solution to a rather large problem ultimately was a very simple solution if you just knew, what it was to do. So now I want to show you just some parts of his automation that I think are pretty interesting. First thing is the way he customizes our standard reports. It's really pretty cool. I'll make it larger for you so you can see. So those of you might recognize this as just being our detailed report, but it doesn't look like our detailed report because he's put so much customization into it. And he did this for a reason, because customers actually use these reports to verify, and then developers use these reports in order to diagnose problems. And I'm not going to, it's a pretty long report. I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor. But you can see that when you look at his report, you can see everything that's being done in great detail. And I'll show you how he writes all of this stuff, because he's shared some slides that show how he does this. But he writes a lot of information out using print statements into the results just so that you can see exactly what was running. You know, everything is date time stamped. He's given you all the information on the database version, the server, the user, and so forth. But as the test gets going, you see, saying what the test case is, the database that was used, the description that was used. And then each one of this, he's got what he calls it like a table of content or test cases. These are all, I call it table of contents, but I think it's actually test cases. He's got everything detailed. Create a cinema, create a contract. So you kind of get like a, well, I guess it is like a table of contents. You can kind of get information about what you're about to analyze. The test case, the database, the description, the steps. So everything is really specified in great detail so that it makes the report very, very easy to read. You see each step is specified, whether the step passed or failed, whether the verifies have passed or failed. So some good stuff. Now let me show you some slides and talk about how he did that. And again, this will be up on YouTube, so you can study it in greater detail later on. Some things I want to point out, I notice from looking at just his slides that he makes a lot of use of INI files to store information that is shared between tests. So if one test needs something from another test, we can pass parameters between steps, but not between tests. So he uses an INI file to do that. I'm going to show you that on a slide in a couple of minutes. He makes a very flexible use of data-driven steps to perform common actions. So things that are done commonly, he has pulled into either a function or a step so that he can call it, over and over. And then I've already showed you the custom reports. So let's take a look at these slides now. So, we're looking here on the left at one of his test cases, and you'll notice at the very top of the test, so we know it's a test because of the icon green T. We know it's not a step, it's a test. And so he calls something start at the beginning of each test. So he's got these utilities that he created, and they get called from each one of the test cases in order to write the kind of information that we see here in the middle of the slider that I showed you when I showed you the PDF. So you can see where this information is coming from in the report that I showed you. Okay, and he's, put in nice delimiters so that you can see it. And again, remember, this is all just done through print statements as you looked at the utility. So you don't necessarily have to use the custom report kit in order to create a really detailed report. You can use a standard report like the detailed report that he's got here, and he's just customized it by adding a lot of information to it. So he's given us sort of a little bit of a cheat sheet here. So you run start at the beginning of the routine. He logs the description in the table of contents. He checks the sequence status to make sure that like a prior test didn't fail. He collects stored variables, generates any test data that's going to be needed. So those are the kinds of things that are being done here. And again, just to kind of give you a little bit more of a glimpse, this is where the test header comes from, because remember, every single test had a little header. And then any information that he wants to write, he can write info. So he's got these again. He's got, you notice INF, that's calling this function INF. TST is calling this function TST. So he's encapsulated these things into functions that are being called. This is what I was talking about earlier, where he makes use of INI files. So here's like his test. This is the In the INI file, this is the section of the INI file. And then the variables that he's reading and writing, he's doing gets and sets using our INI class. You know that AscentialTest has an INI class right here. Here's the INI class. You can get and set values to INI files, and he's doing that here. When you do that, it's a convenient way to allow one test to get information from a previous test. You write it here in one test, and then you read it from another. And then this is the last slide here. Again, more information that's being written during the execution of the test. So inside of his steps, he's actually writing information inside the steps and writing it to the INI files. Now I have a couple more slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to any questions that we might have. For those of you that enjoy coming to these seminars or watching them later on, seeking topic suggestions, I've got some more ideas, but always seeking topic suggestions for upcoming seminars. So think about features of AscentialTest that you'd like to know more about, maybe things that you just don't understand well, things that you think other people would be interested in, and please just send those suggestions to support@zenix.com. We'd love to hear from you. Just give you a quick little glimpse of what's going on right now with 9.9. It's almost finished. We've just about completed version control for TFS, in Azure DevOps, because we're going to be building out our integration with Azure DevOps throughout the year. We've already supported being able to run AscentialTest through your pipelines, and we have a published pipeline task that you can use. That's been out there now for a while. We're working on the version control right now. We're waiting for a fix from Microsoft. So this might not actually make 9.9. It might have to sit there waiting for a fix from Microsoft. We've been pressuring them. Hopefully they'll fix the ability to create a lock from the REST API, which they published an API that allows us through REST, that allows us to do your checkout, your check-in, your history, your status. Those of you that use our SVN know the different features of the version control. Well, we've got all of them working except for a lock, because they forgot to allow us to set a lock. So evidently nobody else has been using this REST, because they were surprised by it when I identified to them that there was no way to actually lock a file. You can do it through the command line, but not through REST. So we're waiting on that. Our custom object support will be finished hopefully next Friday. No, this Friday. What this means is that if you have a custom object now, we've kind of given you, loosely I'll call an extension kit. You can provide, just by answering a call that we've provided, information that allows us to populate our snapshot with information about your custom object so that it will look just like a standard object in AscentialTest. And we're working with a company called Omnis. They're going to be the first users of this, and we're working with them over the next couple of weeks to test it, make sure that it works, and then it'll be part of 9.9. We've opened up render text for some new data window presentation styles. Glencore needed composite and crosstab and now label. We haven't done label yet, but we'll be doing label this week or next. Contemporary style menus. Those folks that have used contemporary style menus with Power Builder know that they always came out as owner draw. If you were using traditional menus, everything was fine, but if you had contemporary menus, AscentialTest could not see the text. Well, we worked with Appian on this, and Appian has fixed the issue. So now your contemporary style menus, you can see all the strings now in AscentialTest. So no more having to use indexes and use all kinds of weird strategies when the indexes change. So that's going to be really good news for the Power Builder community of AscentialTest users who have contemporary style menus. And that has already been out there in their last point release, so it's already out there now. And you have to get with the newest version of Appian Power Builder in order to get this, but we have confirmation from at least one customer that this is now working. Also, Appian has fixed the scroll bar issue, so the PB themes now work without having to go into AscentialTest and make that setting on the scroll bar issue, so that's been resolved. Some updates, excuse me, I need to sip the water. We've noticed that from working with folks in support, that for some reason, folks don't see our tabs. I think what we did was we tried to make AscentialTest kind of harmonious so that everything kind of blends in. But we noticed from working with folks that, especially when we're in a situation like this, people do not see that these are sub-tabs. They constantly go over here and open something that's right in front of them. So we're working on making those more visible so that you will notice that. Also, the navigate icon. I can't tell you how many folks don't know that when you're looking at, and I don't think I have one in this project, but when you're looking at a call stack in AscentialTest where it says called from this line, called from that line, people do not know that you can double click on that line in order to go right into the line. You need that for debugging. So now there's going to be a little navigate icon, you know, our little sort of curved arrow. That's going to be sitting there right next to the line so that you'll know to click it. Customers suggested that our WebDriver command prompt should not come up maximized because it sometimes sits right on top of the application. So that's going to come up minimized. A really good suggestion, I can't remember, I'm sorry, I can't remember whoever suggested it, that in our version control, that if a file is out of date and you see the little white circle, why not color the circles for the files that are out of date? So that's going to get done as well. Bunch of bug fixes. Roke, if you're out there, you'll be happy to know that now when you try to use a symbol in a query for a data store, that's generating an unknown error right now. And we're going to be fixing that as well, along with a number of other things. So those things are coming.